The following is a first-hand report from the Battle of Waterloo, as told by Sir Captain John Kincaid of Britain's famed 95th Rifles, one of the most elite units in Wellington's army. Kincaid fought on the front lines. He saw the cavalry charges, the cannon fire, the squares, and the chaos, and the bloodshed up close, and he wrote it all down. What you're about to hear is his first-hand account of that day, raw, vivid, and unforgettable. This isn't a historian retelling the battle. This is one of the men who survived it, speaking across time to tell you exactly what it felt like to stand in line against Napoleon's Grand Armée. If you ever wanted to know what it truly felt like to face the French Imperial Guard, to hear the panic, the courage, the smoke, and the slaughter, stay right here. This is John Kincaid at the Battle of Waterloo.
The Battle of Waterloo, the 18th of June, 1815. When I awoke this morning at daylight, I found myself drenched with rain. I had slept so long and so soundly that I had, at first, but a very confused notion of my situation. But having a bright idea that my horse had been my companion when I went to sleep, I was rather startled at finding that I was now alone, nor could I rub my eyes clear enough to procure a sight of him, which was vexatious enough, for, independent of his value, as a horse, his services were indispensable, and an adjutant might as well think of going into action without his arms as without such a supporter. But whatever my feelings might have been towards him, it was evident that he had none for me, from having drawn his sword and marched off. The chances of finding him again, amid 10,000 others, were about equal to the odds against the needle in a bundle of hay. But for once, the single chance was gained, as, after a diligent search of an hour, he was discovered between two artillery horses about half a mile from where he broke loose. The weather cleared up as the morning advanced, and, though everything remained quiet at the moment, we were confident that the day would not pass off without an engagement, and, therefore, proceeded to put our arms in order as, also, to get ourselves dried and made as comfortable as circumstances would permit. We made a fire against the wall of Sir Andrew Barnard's cottage and boiled a huge camp kettle full of tea mixed up with a suitable quantity of milk and sugar for breakfast, and, as it stood on the edge of the high road, where all the big wigs of the army had occasion to pass, in the early part of the morning, I believe almost every one of them, from the Duke downwards, claimed a cupful. About 9 o'clock, we received an order to retain a quantity of spare ammunition in some secure place, and to send everything in the shape of baggage and baggage animals to the rear. It, therefore, became evident that the Duke meant to give battle in his present position, and it was, at the same time, generally understood that a corps of 30,000 Prussians were moving to our support. About 10 o'clock, an unusual bustle was observable among the staff officers, and we soon after received an order to stand to our arms. The troops who had been stationed in our front during the night were then moved off to the right, and our division took up its fighting position. Our battalion stood on what was considered the left center of the position. We had our right resting on the Namur road, about 100 yards in rear of the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, and our left extending behind a broken hedge, which ran along the ridge to the left. Immediately in our front, and divided from La Haye-Sainte only by the great road, stood a small knoll with a sand hole in its farthest side, which we occupied as an advanced post, with 3 companies. The remainder of the division was formed in 2 lines, the first consisting chiefly of light troops behind the hedge in continuation from the left of our battalion reserve, and the second about 100 yards in its rear. The guns were placed in the intervals between the brigades. 2 pieces were in the roadway on our right, and a rocket brigade in the center. The road had been cut through the rising ground, and was about 20 or 30 feet deep where our right rested, and which, in a manner, separated us from all the troops beyond. The division, I believe, under General Alten, occupied the ground next to us, on the right. He had a light battalion of the German Legion, posted inside of La Haye-Sainte, and a household brigade of cavalry stood under cover of the rising ground behind him. On our left there were some Hanoverians and Belgians, together with a brigade of British heavy dragoons, the Royals, and Scotch Greys. These were all the observations on the disposition of our army that my situation enabled me to make. The whole position seemed to be a gently rising ground, presenting no obstacle at any point, excepting the broken hedge in front of our division, and it was only one in appearance, as it could be passed in every part. Shortly after we had taken up our ground, some columns from the enemy's left were seen in motion towards Hougoumont and were soon warmly engaged with the right of our army. A cannonball, too, came from the Lord knows where, for it was not fired at us, and took the head off our right-hand man. That part of their position, in our own immediate front, next claimed our undivided attention. It had hitherto been looking suspiciously innocent, with scarcely a human being upon it, but innumerable black specks were now seen taking post at regular distances in its front, and recognizing them as so many pieces of artillery, I knew from experience, although nothing else was yet visible, that they were unerring symptoms of our not being destined to be idle spectators. From the moment we took possession of the knoll, we had busied ourselves in collecting branches of trees and other things, for the purpose of making an abattis to block up the road between that and the farmhouse, and soon completed one, which we thought looked sufficiently formidable to keep out the whole of the French cavalry, but it was put to the proof sooner than we expected by a troop of our own light dragoons, who, having occasion to gallop through, astonished us not a little by clearing away every stick of it. We had just time to replace the scattered branches, when the whole of the enemy's artillery opened, and their countless columns began to advance under cover of it. The scene at that moment was grand and imposing, and we had a few minutes to spare for observation. The column destined as our particular friends first attracted our notice and seemed to consist of about 10,000 infantry. A smaller body of infantry and one of cavalry moved on their right, and, on their left, another huge column of infantry and a formidable body of cuirassiers, while beyond them it seemed one moving mass. We saw Bonaparte himself take post on the side of the road, immediately in our front, surrounded by a numerous staff, and each regiment, as they passed him, rent the air with shouts of "Vive l'Empereur!" Nor did they cease after they had passed, but, backed by the thunder of their artillery, and carrying with them the snap of drums and the blast of trumpets, in addition to their increasing shouts, it looked, at first, as if they had some hopes of scaring us off the ground. For it was a singular contrast to the stern silence reigning on our side, where nothing, as yet, but the voices of our great guns told that we had mouths to open when we chose to use them. Our rifles were, however, in a very few seconds, required to play their parts, and open such a fire on the advancing skirmishers as quickly brought them to a standstill. But their columns advanced steadily through them, although our incessant tirade was telling in their center with fearful exactness, and our post was quickly turned in both flanks, which compelled us to fall back and join our comrades. Behind the hedge, though not before some of our officers and theirs had been engaged in personal combat. When the heads of their columns showed over the knoll which we had just quit, they received such a fire from our first line that they wavered and hung behind it a little, but, cheered and encouraged by the gallantry of their officers, who were dancing and flourishing their swords in front, they at last boldly advanced to the opposite side of our hedge and began to deploy. Our first line, in the meantime, was getting so thinned that Picton found it necessary to bring up his second, but fell in the act of doing it. The command of the division, at that critical moment, devolved upon Sir James Kempt, who was galloping along the line, animating the men to steadiness. He called to me by name, where I happened to be standing on the right of our battalion, and desired that I would never quit that spot. I told him that he might depend upon it, and in another instant I found myself in a fair way of keeping my promise more religiously than I intended, for, glancing my eye to the right, I saw the next field covered with the cuirassiers, some of whom were making directly for the gap in the hedge where I was standing. I had not hitherto drawn my sword, as it was generally to be had at a moment's warning, but, from its having been exposed to the last night's rain, it had now got rusted in the scabbard, and refused to come forth. I was in a precious scrape. Mounted on my strong Flanders mare, and with my good old sword in my hand, I would have braved all the chances without a moment's hesitation, but, I confess, that I felt considerable doubts as to the propriety of standing there to be sacrificed, without the means of making a scramble for it. My mind, however, was happily relieved from such an embarrassing consideration before my decision was required, For the next moment, the cuirassiers were charged by our household brigade, and the infantry in our front giving way at the same time. Under our terrific shower of musketry, the flying cuirassiers tumbled in among the routed infantry, followed by the life guards, who were cutting away in all directions. Hundreds of the infantry threw themselves down and pretended to be dead, while the cavalry galloped over them and then got up and ran away. I never saw such a scene in all my life. Lord Wellington had given orders that the troops were, on no account, to leave the position to follow up any temporary advantage, so that we now resumed our post as we stood at the commencement of the battle, and with 3 companies again advanced on the knoll. I was told it was very ridiculous, at that moment, to see the number of vacant spots that were left nearly along the whole of the line, where a great part of the dark-dressed foreign troops had stood, intermixed with the British, when the action began. Our division got considerably reduced in numbers during the last attack, but Lord Wellington's fostering hand sent Sir John Lambert to our support with the 6th Division, and we now stood prepared for another and a more desperate struggle. Our battalion had already lost 3 officers killed and 6 or 7 wounded. Among the latter were Sir Andrew Barnard and Colonel Cameron. Someone asking me what had become of my horse's ear was the first intimation I had of his being wounded, and I now found that, independent of one ear having been shaved close to his head, I suppose by a cannon shot, a musket ball had grazed across his forehead and another gone through one of his legs, but he did not seem much the worse for either of them. Between 2 and 3 o'clock we were tolerably quiet, except from a thundering cannonade, and the enemy had, by that time, got the range of our position so accurately that every shot brought a ticket for somebody's head. An occasional gun, beyond the plain, far to our left, marked the approach of the Prussians, but their progress was too slow to afford a hope of their arriving in time to take any share in the battle. On our right, the roar of cannon and musketry had been incessant from the time of its commencement, but the higher ground, near us, prevented our seeing anything of what was going on. Between 3 and 4 o'clock, the storm gathered again in our front. Our 3 companies on the knoll were soon involved in a furious fire. The Germans, occupying La Haye-Sainte, expended all their ammunition and fled from the post. The French took possession of it, and, as it flanked our knoll, we were obliged to abandon it also and fall back again behind the hedge. The loss of La Haye-Sainte was of the most serious consequence, as it afforded the enemy an establishment within our position. They immediately brought up 2 guns on our side of it and began serving out some grape to us, but they were so very near that we destroyed their artillerymen before they could give us a second round. The silencing of these guns was succeeded by a very extraordinary scene. On the same spot, a strong regiment of Hanoverians advanced in line to charge the enemy out of La Haye-Sainte, but they were themselves charged by a brigade of cuirassiers, and, excepting one officer on a little black horse, who went off to the rear like a shot out of a shovel, I do believe that every man of them was put to death in about 5 seconds. A brigade of British light dragoons advanced to their relief, and a few, on each side, began exchanging thrusts, but it seemed likely to be a drawn battle between them, without much harm being done, when our men brought it to a crisis sooner than either side anticipated, for they previously had their rifles eagerly pointed at the cuirassiers, with a view of saving the perishing Hanoverians, but the fear of killing their friends withheld them, until the others were utterly overwhelmed, when they instantly opened a terrific fire on the whole concern, sending both sides to flight, so that, on the small space of ground, within 100 yards of us, where 5,000 men had been fighting the instant before, there was not now a living soul to be seen. It made me mad to see the cuirassiers, in their retreat, stooping and stabbing at our wounded men as they lay on the ground. How I wished that I had been blessed with omnipotent power for a moment, that I might have blighted them. The same field continued to be a wild one the whole of the afternoon. It was a sort of dueling post between the 2 armies, every half hour showing a meeting of some kind upon it, but they never exceeded a short scramble, for men's lives were held very cheap there. For the 2 or 3 succeeding hours there was no variety with us, but one continued blaze of musketry. The smoke hung so thick about that, although not more than 80 yards asunder, we could only distinguish each other by the flashes of the pieces. A good many of our guns had been disabled, and a great many more rendered unserviceable in consequence of the unprecedented close fighting, for, in several places, where they had been posted but a very few yards in front of the line, it was impossible to work them. I shall never forget the scene which the field of battle presented about 7 in the evening. I felt weary and worn out, less from fatigue than anxiety. Our division, which had stood upwards of 5,000 men at the commencement of the battle, had gradually dwindled down into a solitary line of skirmishers. The 27th Regiment were lying literally dead, in square, a few yards behind us. My horse had received another shot through the leg, and one through the flap of the saddle, which lodged in his body, sending him a step beyond the pension list. The smoke still hung so thick about us that we could see nothing. I walked a little way to each flank, to endeavour to get a glimpse of what was going on, but nothing met my eye except the mangled remains of men and horses, and I was obliged to return to my post as wise as I went. I had never yet heard of a battle in which everybody was killed, but this seemed likely to be an exception, as all were going by turns. We got excessively impatient under the tame similitude of the latter part of the process, and burned with desire to have a last thrust at our respective vis, for, however desperate our affairs were, we had still the satisfaction of seeing that theirs were worse. Sir John Lambert continued to stand as our support, at the head of 3 good old regiments, 1 dead, the 27th, and 2 living ones, and we took the liberty of soliciting him to aid our views. But the Duke's orders on that head were so very particular that the gallant general had no choice. Presently, a cheer, which we knew to be British, commenced far to the right, and made everyone prick up his ears. It was Lord Wellington's long-wished, for orders to advance. It gradually approached, growing louder as it grew near. We took it up by instinct, charged through the hedge down upon the old knoll, sending our adversaries flying at the point of the bayonet. Lord Wellington galloped up to us at the instant, and our men began to cheer him, but he called out, "No cheering, my lads, but forward and complete your victory." This movement had carried us clear of the smoke, and, to people who had been for so many hours enveloped in darkness, in the midst of destruction, and naturally anxious about the result of the day, the scene which now met the eye conveyed a feeling of more exquisite gratification than can be conceived. It was a fine summer's evening, just before sunset. The French were flying in one confused mass. British lines were seen in close pursuit, and in admirable order, as far as the eye could reach to the right, while the plain to the left was filled with Prussians. The enemy made one last attempt at a stand on the rising ground to our right of La Belle Alliance, but a charge from General Adams's brigade again threw them into a state of confusion, which was now inextricable, and their ruin was complete. Artillery, baggage, and everything belonging to them fell into our hands. After pursuing them until dark, we halted about 2 miles beyond the field of battle, leaving the Prussians to follow up the victory. This was the last, the greatest, and the most uncomfortable heap of glory that I ever had a hand in, and may the deuce take me if I think that everybody waited there to see the end of it. Otherwise it never could have been so troublesome to those who did. We were, take us all in all, a very bad army. Our foreign auxiliaries, who constituted more than half of our numerical strength, with some exceptions, were little better than a raw militia, a body without a soul, or like an inflated pillow that gives to the touch and resumes its shape again when the pressure ceases, not to mention the many who went clear out of the field and were only seen while plundering our baggage in their retreat. Our heavy cavalry made some brilliant charges in the early part of the day, but they never knew when to stop, their ardour in following their advantages carrying them headlong on, until many of them burnt their fingers and got dispersed or destroyed. Of that gallant corps, the Royal Artillery, it is enough to say that they maintained their former reputation, the first in the world, and it was a serious loss to us, in the latter part of the day, to be deprived of this more powerful cooperation from the causes already mentioned. The British infantry in the King's German Legion continued the inflexible supporters of their country's honour throughout, and their unshaken constancy, under the most desperate circumstances, showed that, though they might be destroyed, they were not to be beaten. If Lord Wellington had been at the head of his old peninsular army, I am confident that he would have swept his opponents off the face of the earth immediately after their first attack. But with such a heterogeneous mixture under his command, he was obliged to submit to a longer day. It will ever be a matter of dispute what the result of that day would have been without the arrival of the Prussians. But it is clear to me that Lord Wellington would not have fought at Waterloo unless Blücher had promised to aid him with 30,000 men, as he required that number to put him on a numerical footing with his adversary. It is certain that the promised aid did not come in time to take any share whatever in the battle. It is equally certain that the enemy had, long before, been beaten into a mass of ruin, in condition for nothing but running, and wanting but an apology to do it. And I will ever maintain that Lord Wellington's last advance would have made it the same victory had a Prussian never been seen there. The field of battle, next morning, presented a frightful scene of carnage. It seemed as if the world had tumbled to pieces, and 3/4 of everything destroyed in the wreck. The ground running parallel to the front of where we had stood was so thickly strewed with fallen men and horses that it was difficult to step clear of their bodies, many of the former still alive, and imploring assistance, which it was not in our power to bestow. The usual salutation on meeting an acquaintance of another regiment after an action was to ask who had been hit, but on this occasion, it was who's alive? Meeting one, next morning, a very little fellow, I asked what had happened to them yesterday. "I'll be hanged," says he, "if I know anything at all about the matter, for I was all day trodden in the mud and galloped over by every scoundrel who had a horse, and, in short, that I only owe my existence to my insignificance." 2 of our men, on the morning of the 19th, lost their lives by a very melancholy accident. They were cutting up a captured ammunition wagon for firewood when one of their swords, striking against a nail, sent a spark among the powder. When I looked in the direction of the explosion, I saw the 2 poor fellows about 20 or 30 feet up in the air. On falling to the ground, though lying on their backs or bellies, some extraordinary effort of nature, caused by the agony of the moment, made them spring from that position 5 or 6 times to the height of 8 or 10 feet, just as a fish does when thrown on the ground after being newly caught. It was so unlike a scene in real life that it was impossible to witness it without forgetting, for a moment, the horror of their situation. I ran to the spot along with others, and found that every stitch of clothes had been burnt off, and they were black as ink all over. They were still alive, and told us their names, otherwise we could not have recognized them, and, singular enough, they were able to walk off the ground with a little support, but died shortly after. Among other officers who fell at Waterloo, we lost one of the wildest youths that ever belonged to the service. He seemed to have a prophetic notion of his approaching end, for he repeatedly told us, in the early part of the morning, that he knew the devil would have him before night. I shall relate one anecdote of him, which occurred while we were in Spain. He went, by chance, to pass the day with 2 officers, quartered at a neighboring village, who happened to be, that day, engaged to dine with the clergyman. Knowing their visitor's mischievous propensities, they were at first afraid to make him one of the party, but, after schooling him into a suitable propriety of behavior, and exacting a promise of implicit obedience, they, at last, ventured to take him. On their arrival, the ceremony of introduction had just been gone through, and their host seated at an open window, when a favourite cat of his went purring about the young gentleman's boots, who, catching it by the tail, and giving it 2 or 3 preparatory swings round his head, sent it flying out at the window where the parson was sitting, who only escaped it by suddenly stooping. The only apology the youngster made for his conduct was, "Egad, I think I astonished that fellow, but whether it was the cat or the parson, he meant I never could learn." About 12 o'clock, on the day after the battle, we commenced our march for Paris. I shall, therefore, leave my readers at Waterloo, in the hope that, among the many stories of romance to which that and the other celebrated fields gave birth, the foregoing unsophisticated one of an eyewitness may not have been found altogether uninteresting.
This concludes John Kincaid's report of the Battle of Waterloo. If you want to hear more real accounts, legendary tales, and true history from the Napoleonic era, told through the eyes of the people who lived it, more incredible tales are coming out each week. Be sure to check out our history playlist, and definitely don't miss our video on the legendary cavalry charge at Somosierra. The accomplishments of these cavalrymen will absolutely blow your mind. I'm Connor with the Motion Visual. See you next time, and vive l'Empereur.